Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. I'm Cléa Daridan, Senior Curator, Culture Lead at Community Jameel. This conversation is part of DAFQA, which means splash in Arabic, and it's part of Community Jameel's Ocean program at COP28 in Dubai, which explores the intersection of ocean health and climate change. We wanted to bring together scientists, creatives, and institutional perspectives working to protect the ocean. This panel will bridge, at least I hope so, the laboratory, the artist studio, the institution. We will try and look at all of those different perspectives to explore how interdisciplinary collaboration can help us rethink our relationship with the seas, but not only the seas, the rivers, the water in general. The discussion will consider practical solutions, including research and artistic approaches to tackling the effects of climate change on our oceans, of course, but also, and most importantly, on our communities. Water is a force. It produces history, culture, languages, stories that all of us, in some way or another, know. Bodies of water can also create ruptures, crises, movements. They can also tell very frightening stories. The belief in water is, as far as we can tell, something that we've all known about. We've all been close to certain stories and beliefs in water. Now, I would like, this was a very brief introduction, but I would like to introduce our panelists. We are very happy today to have 3 of them from various parts of the world, which is great. And thank you very much to all of you 3 for joining us today. Nadia Christidi, lovely having you. Nadia is a researcher, a writer, and an arts practitioner. You are currently a PhD candidate in history, anthropology, science, technology, society, and whatnot at MIT. Your research looks at how cities that face water supply challenges are expected to intensify with climate change, and how they are imagining, planning, preparing for the future of water. You have a particular interest in the roles that art, design, architecture are playing in that future imagining and future planning process. You hold an MA. I usually don't do this, but I do find it interesting to have kind of a background. So you hold an MA in historical studies from the New School for Social Research, and you have exhibited your work at Beirut Art Center, Salt Galata in Istanbul, among others. And just to explain, this is a friendly conversation because Nadia, you have been a researcher and writer in residence at Ocean Space with TBA 21 and at the Jameel Art Center with Art Jameel. So we are here among friends, which feels good. Nora, you are Deputy Director in charge of the arts at Art Jameel. Thank you for hosting us. You manage the exhibition program at the Jameel Art Center. You contribute to curatorial thinking across the board. Your previous roles include heading up programs at the Sursak Museum in Beirut and curating public programs at Tate in London. You have an MA, again, from anthropology and cultural politics from Goldsmiths in London, where you also designed and taught an MA course entitled Critical Pedagogy in Contested Space. Thank you. And then, last but not least, Marcus Raymond, you are director of TBA21, a non-profit cultural organization you co-founded in 2011 that fosters interdisciplinary dialogue and exchange surrounding the most urgent ecological, social, economic issues facing, but not only, our oceans today. You lead the Academy's engagement with artists, activists, scientists, and policymakers. You, of course, commission a lot, which allow us to understand and to be in contact with new bodies of knowledge, new policies advancing the conservation and protection of the oceans. In March 2019, TBA21 launched Ocean Space in Venice, a new anchorage for ocean literacy, research, and advocacy. It's located in Venice. If any one of you pass by Venice, please do go and visit it. Not only is it a beautiful space, but it's also hosting incredible programs, so please do. Thank you very much, also, Marcus, for being with us today. So, just to jump into it, I think there are a few questions, at least, that have come to my mind. There are many others that might come to your mind, and I do hope that after we listen to our panelists, you will also be able to share your questions. But a few of them that came to my mind: how can art raise awareness about oceans? How can it inspire action? How can art be a powerful tool to explore the interconnection between oceans and climate change? Can or cannot art shape our values? Can it shift our behaviors when it comes to oceans? How can art institutions give their audiences the opportunity to imagine new possible futures in the face of climate change? Now, first question, and this is for you, Nora. Art Jameel has a vast experience in exhibiting works which combine a scientific approach and a creative lens. How can we leverage this unique perspective that you have, especially in the region, in order to transform our approach to the climate emergency?
Thank you, Cléa. And thank you, everyone. And it's really, I'm super happy to be among friends here. So one thing, it's been great to also listen into conversations happening at COP and in other places about these very, very big issues and crises we're facing, and to think about what role, as you say, can we play in the face of this. On the one hand, there's so much out there in terms of the crisis of oceans, of air pollution, all the effects of climate change. So I see our work here, in a way, works to sort of work against the abstraction of climate change, if you will. So we're faced with a lot of data, a lot of information, but we really don't understand what that means on a very personal, even community level. So how can we sort of take all that information, break it down, look at its texture, look what it means in our daily life, look how it affects daily communities. And one example of this is just the idea of a threshold, which we explore in one of our podcasts in the World Weather Network. So what does a threshold mean? If we can zoom into that threshold and look what happens on it, what's the threshold between 1 degree or 1.5 degrees as an acceptable temperature change? What does that mean in that threshold? Is it a threshold between life and death? Is it a threshold between, overheating or not? When you abstract climate change, you somehow abstract everyone's ability to kind of think and relate to it. So I really think our role here is to sort of break it down and engage people in very, very personal ways. And, as you mentioned, we do that through our exhibitions programs as well, through the World Weather Network that I mentioned, working with different cultural producers in the region to think about humidity. And again, this is a term, relative humidity, right? So it's the amount of water in the air relative to temperature. But what does that really mean? How does it work on your body? So relative humidity affects your ability to sweat. And the more heat you have and humidity you have, the less you'll be able to sweat and cool yourself. So in the future, what does that mean for labor here? What does it mean for how you walk outside? So all of these things we want to kind of unpick how they sort of relate to us on a very personal level.
And from a programmatic perspective, I remember an exhibition that you put up that was called An Ocean in Every Drop, which was a beautiful title. Could you tell us a bit more about this one?
Thank you. Yeah, so again, this was looking at, humans' relationship to water. And you mentioned kind of the future, but I would also say it's really important to look at the past. And I don't think we do that enough, actually. Because yes, we exist in a certain world, in a certain system right now, but so many other worlds existed before. And it's so interesting to look back at that and see, how was the ocean mapped in kind of Islamic cartography, for example. The ocean was the center of the world and everything else flowed from there. To look back at kind of water lore or folklore, as Jumana Emil Aboud did in the exhibition. She has a vast body of work that sort of works on Palestinian folktale, reconnecting sort of communities to water spaces and springs through bringing back traditional folktales and water lore. So how do we reconnect that very personal and communal relationship to water and space? How do we look at the cultural, social, and political lives of a river, for example? So Vietnamese artist Thao Nguyen Phan looked at the Mekong and kind of its many lives across folklore, across sort of development, across agriculture, and bringing that together to paint an understanding of a body of water. Again, I think, we're faced with so much data, so if the only affect we can generate is kind of fear and apathy, then we're failing at something. So how do we generate affect of kind of hope, of change, of commitment? And that's where I really think, as an art space, we can do that.
Thank you, Nora. One for you, Marcus. You have a very strong track record and kind of a unique record also of supporting interdisciplinary collaborations between artists, scientists, researchers on ocean-related projects. Can you share examples of successful projects that have bridged the gap, effectively bridged the gap between art and science, leading to practical solutions for ocean conservation, ocean health, and global health also?
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for hosting us again. I think it's quite telling that this conversation in this setup, or these two panels back to back, happen here in a cultural institution. No, it's but to your answer, what are successful examples? No, the question is, what is success in that sense? And maybe just following up on what was said before. No, the question that kind of comes, or that I was thinking about earlier in the panel. No, the science we need for the ocean we want. No, who's the we and who determines the want? No, this is kind of, and I think this is a good question to actually ask artists and art institutions. What we've become very good at is understanding audiences, our audiences, and audiences that we don't reach, right? And artists are the guys that, or the people that are very well equipped to imagining futures. No, so I think it's good to have this conversation here. In this under this topic, successful collaborations. What we've done from the very beginning is we've created these moments of shared experiences, where artists, together with scientists, environmentalists, legal experts, and later on when we were in Oceania in the Pacific, more and more indigenous colleagues actually spent time together, without the urgency of producing anything, except of engagement with each other in the places that they've gone to, and the places, and actually the ocean. The question, what is the ocean? What happens is in that moment is that people actually speak from a shared experience rather than just a shared language. This shared language is very often English, which is deceiving, no? Because we use terms like sustainability that mean very different things in very different contexts. And currently, you just inject sustainability into any title, and it seems to be good. The oil dependency sustainability program, for example, right? But when you speak from a shared experience, there's something else, no? There's something very concrete that you talk about. We had a project together with a Danish artist group called Superflex on the journey that they undertook to Tonga, to Hunga Tonga, which was at the time the youngest island in the Pacific after a volcanic eruption. On that journey, they had a fish behavioral specialist called Alex Jordan. He's part of the Max Planck Institute, and they were looking at questions of sea level rise. No, at a time where more and more people move to urban centers at the coasts, and the sea level rise exponentially just means that we have all of these structures that will sink at some point, no, or be partially underwater. So what they were thinking about is, can we actually create architecture of the future that is inhabited by humans now, will be co-inhabited by human and marine species at a certain point, and will be taken over by marine species? What does that mean for materials, for structures, and so on? This is a highly speculative project and sounds absurd, but what it has led to is actually that they're now in a part of a project, or have initiated a project which they call poetically Super Reef. Everything with Superflex is super. And where they are restoring 55 square kilometers of stone reef off the Danish coast. This is not their project. It's a collaborative initiative, and what happens when artists call is that they bring people together that would usually not be together. No, there's a very strange convening power that artists and art organizations have, because they're non-threatening in this space of conservation. The space of conservation is still governed by competition, mainly because of funding mechanisms. No, and I think this is, the sustainability, the Sustainable Development Goal 17 is collaboration, but I think a lot of our organizations are not really set up to collaborate. No, they're set up to compete, and so we need to create these spaces where we can actually rehearse multi-scalar, multi-sector collaborations, which are incredibly difficult, not only to govern, but also just to create this language that we can create meaningful collaborations. That was a very long and meandering answer.
No, thank you. I think you brought up a particularly interesting connection to what you're working on, Nadia. And I think one point that I will definitely pick up is vocabulary. I think this is maybe one of the key points and key ideas to what all of us are trying to do. Meaning, if you want people to get a better understanding of the urgency and how you might be able to shift behaviors, well, then you need to give them the keys and the tools to do so. And vocabulary is definitely one of them. So, Nadia, I had one tricky question for you, sorry. You are yourself a perfect example of cross-disciplinary work. And you've had experience, of course, as we mentioned, with Jameel, with TBA21 through Ocean Space, but also with JWAFs, which is another sister organization of ours, but you will probably be able to tell us more about this. Your current research centers on the future of water supply in cities facing challenges exacerbated by climate change. Can you share insights? How does the integration of art, design, architecture help cities better imagine, plan, prepare for the future? While also addressing climate-related challenges?
Thank you very much for your question and for the invitation and opportunity for me to participate in this conversation with really good friends. So it's really nice to be here. So I'll just start off maybe by giving you a little bit of context of how I got interested in the arts and the role that the arts play. So as Cléa mentioned, I am a PhD candidate at MIT, and I look at how cities that are in dry lands, so places including Dubai, which is one of my field sites, are planning for the future of water. And I'm really interested in kind of transitions, ongoing changes, and the kind of creative thinking that we're going to have to do as we embark on these transitions. And in that process, I'm talking to engineers and water planners, but also architects and artists and designers to see, how are artists also imagining this future. And of course, while I focus on water supply, that also intersects with oceans because all of it is one water to begin with, but then places like Dubai, which rely on desalination, those two really overlap. So that's just a broad overview. So I came to this interest in the arts. First of all, your comment about fear and kind of the affective role of art is really important. And I think for me, like the place I kind of am coming to this interest is this really, inspiration, I think. Like how can the arts provide us with different proposals or ideas for what that future might look like, which I think is a really important role for the arts. So I look in particular at a type of work that these two curators in the late 1990s called ecoventions, which are works that are, the term combines ecological and intervention, and they tend to be these really large-scale, ambitious projects that intervene into a local environment. They're kind of similar to what you're talking about in terms of the Super Reef project. And they tend to involve, artists and science collaborations because they're ecological, they're also large scale, so they have a big impact. They need buy-in from local communities, from urban planners, from policymakers. So they're really these very interesting kind of maybe pilots for how things might be done differently. And I'll give an example, and this is actually an example that I hadn't thought I would talk about today, so bear with me. I hope that it's not confusing, but it's a project that I look at in Los Angeles, which has a really long title. It's called The Bays of San Francisco Become a 400,000-acre estuarial lagoon when the oceans rise about 3 meters. So it's a project by the Center for the Study of the Force Majeure, which is a center at the University of California in Santa Cruz. It was started by two really famous eco-artists, Newton Harrison and Helen Mayer Harrison. And the project deals with a particular lagoon, which is the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta. And for those who aren't familiar with it, it's basically where two major rivers in Northern California meet and empty out into the San Francisco Bay. And this area, like many deltas, including the Po Delta near Venice, it was developed into farming land. These levee systems were built, the area was drained, and there's all kinds of ecological problems as a result of that. With rising sea levels, this environment is threatened. And the reason why I look at it in my own work is because one of the most important sources of water for cities in the south, including Los Angeles, actually runs through this delta. And with sea level rise and potential sea level intrusion, that water supply is very much threatened. So the radical thing that the Center for the Study of the Force Majeure kind of proposes is to allow it to flood. Basically, like they're expecting with a 6 to 7 degree Fahrenheit rise in temperature, they are expecting that it could flood up to 3 meters, which would basically lead to water coming in all the way as far in as Bakersfield. And the suggestion is to kind of let it flood and become this estuarial lagoon of shallow, salty lakes that could be turned into fish farming. Basically, that's done sustainably. So this area, which has been drained and has become major farming land for California, becomes a major fish farming area done more sustainably. And I think that this project is really interesting because even though I find it problematic in many ways, and we can talk about all the problems, like what happens to that water supply, what happens to all the people, we need to think a little bit more about things like that. But I think it's really interesting because it's radical, and these are actually the types of things that we're going to have to be thinking through, as opposed to, like installing some solar panels on a building, which just isn't going to get us to where we need to be getting. And to echo some of the things that Marcus said, I think, the arts are kind of where these types of contributions can be made, because there's a lot of openness and flexibility to experimentation. There's lower barriers to implementation than the spaces of government and science. There's the opportunity of audience engagement and enrolling local communities. So there's all these ways in which the arts allows for these types of projects to emerge that might not emerge in other spaces. And I think the challenge now is to think, okay, then how do we, take something like this, which is a proposal, and make it a reality, and in the process also, maybe involve some social scientists in thinking through its implications. But yeah.
And policy.
Yeah. Yes, for sure. But I think, that these kinds of ideas are coming out, in the arts for a particular reason, because of the possibilities that the arts allows for that maybe other spaces don't, and that we should, think about then building relationships that allow for them to become either reality, or if they've existed but only at a pilot scale, to become more wide scale, for example.
Thank you so much, Nadia. I think one point that you made that was actually quite interesting, because it's actually a connection that Art Jameel and TBA21 have in Venice, is that both of you actually face water. It's your daily conversation. And I think in the case of Art Jameel, I don't know, but definitely in the case of Venice, you may one day be under water.
I don't think they will let Venice sink.
I don't think so either.
They'll turn it into a lake and turn it into Disneyland, but be sure Venice is not going to sink.
Okay, so it's a safe space, which leads to my next questions to you. You were mentioning, all three of you actually were mentioning, that art is a non-threatening space, which is, I think, something that connects us to the artists themselves. And so I would like to know, going from the institutional perspective to a rather deeper perspective, how is it that you might, each one of you have interacted with the artists that you are yourselves, in the case of maybe of Nadia, if through your arts practice, but the artists that you have exhibited. So first question for you, Nora. In this specific exhibition that you've told us about, an ocean in every drop, you have encouraged us to understand water's profound impact on human history. From what you have experienced alongside the artists that you have presented, how can a deeper understanding of the connections between the humans and water inform our present actions to protect the ocean and combat climate change?
Thank you, Cléa. I wanted to just pick up on another note that was, proposed here about what an art space can do, and you mentioned kind of a non-threatening space, but as we're talking about sort of some stakeholders that can come in and work together, such as policymakers, scientists, but we also, touched on the public, and I think it's really important to note, if we look at sort of public sphere today and where people encounter information, cultural centers are one of the rare spaces where people come, A, open to encounter, and B, it's where you don't know what you're going to encounter, right? So we're, more and more within these kind of algorithmic bubbles or kind of confirmation bias bubbles when we look for information in different places. But I think, we're in a very privileged place here where you walk in the door, you actually don't know what you're going to encounter in the next room, and it might be something you disagree with, it might be something that makes you uncomfortable, it might be something that actually, you learn something from, hopefully, and pushes you to do something different, maybe. But I think that's a really important open space to kind of keep in relation to other spaces that might be closing down. And just because we're kind of still working together, I want to talk about a project out there in the park right now. And you mentioned this idea of a laboratory, and working with Adib Dada, who's sitting there in the back of this hall is the pavilion outside Tarabat, Weaving a Living Form, is really a laboratory, right? It was a huge learning experience. It's a laboratory looking at innovative materials that are made from waste here. It's looking at how we can bring nature back into kind of urban spaces and regenerate nature and what that means, how we can engage the public in an aesthetic experience along the way, right? So it's a learning experience that's also aesthetic and not just about vocabulary, but how you might experience a regenerative space and what that means. And sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but vocabulary was also really interesting because in our conversations we were talking about, specific words in Arabic such as interspecies. We have it in English, we don't have it in Arabic. So how can we also think about building these vocabularies around our shared future as well in different languages? I didn't answer your question, sorry.
Great answer.
Thank you, Nora. No, but really, is that because you mentioned few of them before, and I think it might be interesting actually for the public because not everyone has seen those exhibitions. So it would actually be great if you could pick one example of an artist that you have worked with, and potentially from a personal level has engaged you into thinking your own connection to water differently?
That's a tricky question. I would say I really, learned a lot from working with Joumana Emile Aboud. Again, her approach, which is a very slow, considered, thoughtful, embody and contextualized approach to water and water spaces, working in a very difficult environment in Palestine, looking at reconnecting people to histories of water in that space, histories that have been severed, have been ruptured. Water has been weaponized, as we're seeing now in Gaza and what's happening there, with the denial of water and the closing up of wells. So how do you rebuild that relationship culturally, materially, historically, to something that's been taken away and severed from you. So looking at how she worked with communities in Palestine and outside of Palestine, looking back at sort of folklore and water lore that was lost, but also working to make new folklore around these spaces. So how to reconnect people to their space, because ultimately it's those communities that will care for these spaces. We talk about communities at the threshold of climate change, and you have to look, you have to think about what connects a community to a space, what makes them want to care for their water for future generations, reconnect back to their past. And I think the way she does it is really, quite amazing.
Thank you for your answer. I knew I had to push you to answer to the question. But now, thank you. And this actually brings me to you, Marcus, trying to understand how you might be able to bridge this gap between scientists and artists, because we keep on saying that this is an easy task, but we know it isn't. It's from a professional perspective, but also from a personal perspective, it so happens that so many scientists and also so many artists are not used to, getting into those conversations. So how is it that you bridge this gap? How can we overcome what we might sometimes take as experimental approaches? How can we convert pilots into real life experiences? I think I would definitely be interested in hearing more about this.
Yeah, I think it goes back to something that I mentioned in the first answer, is kind of shared experiences help tremendously. So fieldwork, the importance of fieldwork, and especially, in ocean sciences, marine sciences, there's more and more digital work that's happening. Digital twin is a huge thing, and modeling is a huge thing. And so I think less and less scientists actually go to sea. It's a very expensive undertaking. So a lot more is happening behind screens, which is already mediated, And this is, and I think this is something that again, artists, people that theorize around art and mediation are very aware of. This is that there's a difference. and what this difference is and what this difference means. No, the question, I think, is also why should the arts be engaged in these questions, is because it's contextualized and gives meaning. No? And I think this is what I was referring to earlier. So shared experiences is one thing that's difficult to facilitate. I think the other thing is actually facilitation, is building relationships, building trust amongst these communities. No, very often when you have these art science collaborations, there's nearly an economic exchange. I give you information, you give me visibility, right? It's now one of the mandates that science publications needs to be brought to the people. So I need somehow, there's an equation between art is communication, art is far from communication, right? It's interacting with the public, but it's not communication. It's something else. I think in that facilitation, that there is a building of relationships, and it was said earlier in the panel, no? Somehow it was referred to as local knowledge on the one hand, that is important to recognize, but it's a relationship to the ocean or to the bodies of water that actually create care. And I think what we see now is that the literacy around the climate crisis has increased tremendously, and at the same time, fossil fuel consumption, which drives the climate crisis, has increased continuously, right? So there's not necessarily a link between knowledge and action, right? There's a way shorter distance between relationship and action, right? Because, and so I think that's something where the arts and culture, not only the arts, is important. And the arts in general is a difficult term, no? Because mainly it's artists and they all have very different practices. And so I think that we need to be specific here or have an understanding of specificity without getting lost in detail. And then the other thing that creates empathy, and again, why it's productive to work with artists, is an experience, no? All of a sudden, we see the future happening in front of our eyes right there. No, this is an artificial reef to become. This is many different things to become that is baked into a regenerative experience. Because again, it's like, it's easy to say sustainable, it's easy to say regenerative, it's easy to say all of these things, but what does it mean? How does it feel? What does it look like? Is it desirable? And I think these are the things that we need to create. No, it's desires of a world that we want to inhabit, and therefore it's worth fighting for, right? And I think therefore it's a collaborative effort. It can't just be speculation. It can't just be poetic. It can't just be utopian. It needs to be based actually in possibilities, in realities that are funded in scientific knowledge, but we need to understand what is this world that we want to live in. And yeah.
Yeah, so what is this world that we want to live in without using the word sustainability? or at least
no, if sustainability is part of cultural practice, right, then it means caring for place is a cultural practice, not a practice that we have to do to avert disaster, right? Then it becomes a chore, right? If it becomes part of our cultural landscape, then it's something else. Then it's life.
Can I just add one thing to this sustainability question? I think like also that it becomes sustainability not as an accounting practice, which I feel it often is today.
No, that's very true. And I would like also to ask you one additional question, Nadia. It is very important to consider the cultural narrative and the local context. And you yourself are working in different contexts for your PhD research. How important do you think traditional knowledge and oral history is in this kind of action that we're trying to take?
Thank you. So I guess, I mean, the way that I thought about this question, or I'm thinking about this question, kind of picks up on some of the answers that Marcus was giving also about artist-scientist collaborations. So I'll just start off by saying that for me, my interest is not necessarily in traditional knowledge per se, but in the question of how do we expand what science is, what counts as science, who can contribute to scientific knowledge, and where the evidence for science can be found. And I'm a social scientist, and some of this interest came out of a conversation I had with a climate scientist here in the UAE, who told me that basically to be able to draw a conclusion about climate change, we need to have like at least 2 30-year periods that we can compare, because there's a lot of fluctuation in weather, and when we don't have that kind of extensive data, then we might get noise and draw some conclusions that aren't necessarily reflective of actual climate change. So I thought this was really interesting, and we had this conversation, and I'm interested in precipitation, in particular water supply, and what I realized out of that conversation was that kind of data doesn't exist for precipitation in certain parts of the UAE. It actually doesn't exist in a lot of places in the global south. So places like Venice, for example, have the mean sea level, right, that they've been recording since like the late 19th century. But lots of places in the global south don't have that kind of data. And then you end up with like climate models or climate equations that aren't necessarily reflective of certain realities. Right, so we started thinking, okay, as a social scientist and a scientist, what might we be able to do? And one of the things we thought is, can we draw on oral history interviews or on newspaper sources to understand, to be able to draw these kinds of conclusions or be able to fill in this like quantitative data gap? And, okay, so if we are going to, can we translate this qualitative information into quantitative? What kinds of questions do we need to be asking, or things do we need to be looking for? And then what are the limits of this approach? And, we realized like we wouldn't be able to say that there was this amount of rain, in this year, or that the total amount of rain has changed, because there's no equivalent to like rain gauges, right? But we would be able to, for example, see that we'd be able to understand when were storms happening, how often were they happening, what time of the year, kind of how strong they were, maybe by reported damage, and then to draw some conclusions and be able to say something like, in the distant past, storms often happened in, February, and in the more recent past, they've been happening in December. So that in itself could be an interesting way to kind of use oral history interviews or newspaper archives to draw some kind of meaningful conclusion about climate change in a case where you wouldn't necessarily be able to do that. And this isn't for a climate model, it's for a climate equation. And working with the scientist was really interesting because, I thought, okay, we've reached like the perfect solution. And then he's like, wait, we have to actually double check that this actually works. So what we'll do is we'll take a time period where we have quantitative data for, and then we'll cross-check, do these actually, if we do this methodology with like oral history interviews, and then we check it against the data we actually have, does it align? And so I think these kinds of collaborations are really interesting because I didn't think about certain things, he didn't think about certain things, right? And then we're able to kind of fill in this knowledge gap, and there's so many knowledge gaps going forward, when it comes to climate change, and there's a lot of knowledge gaps to fill, and I think we need to be really creative about how we fill them. And I think, there's other things I could say about that, but I think like one of the things I'm really invested in is also, just as a final conclusion, I think like it's important to draw in, because I think some of the question on local knowledge was touched on in the previous panel, and I'm sure that they have much more experience with this, but I would say like one of the things I'm really invested in is, as we bring in people into these, projects, scientific projects, I think it's not just important to keep in mind, that, there's a lot of different people that hold knowledge and a lot of different types of experiences that are full of knowledge, but also that like people need to be integrated into, what kind of knowledge is actually meaningful to you and has an impact on your life, and do you want to see being produced, I think is really important, because there can sometimes be a disconnect, and I think so we need to like be producing a science that's really like stakeholder involving, not stakeholder engaging necessarily, that's like thinking about that involvement in an ethical way. And that's a science that's much more inclusive.
Thank you, Nadia. And I see the clock ticking, and so I just but actually you've made a great connection to our Q&A, and I would like to introduce this Q&A with Tolga Tahrir, Tolga, you are a Sudanese interdisciplinary researcher born and raised in Dubai. Your main interests lie in unconventional creative research practices that explore the multifaceted dimension of African identity across culture, environment, and art. And most of all, well, not most of all, but you are also part of the Art Jameel Youth Assembly for this year. And so we thought it would be great if you could open this Q&A and hopefully address our panelists, of course, but also the audience. And we're hoping that some of the points that Tolga will raise will also resonate with some of your questions. So yeah, over to you, Tolga, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. First of all, I want to express my gratitude to all the speakers on this panel for an insightful discussion. And again, to just restate, my name is Tuqa Tahir, and I'm a member of this year's Art Jameel Youth Assembly cohort. Today, I'm thrilled to join you as we collectively shed light on the health of oceans through the lens of both sciences and the arts. In the company of all of you, I recall the impact of Naiza Khan's work. The first time I encountered her artworks, I was captivated, assuming a quiet, obedient stature. I sat as I closely listened to the bustling sounds of a coastal city, observing the various colors of waves in Pakistan, and feeling the intimacy of talking about water and the ocean through Naiza's work. In the Mapping Water filmic project, Naiza employs watercolor paintings and drawings, and from her field notes, she offers us ways to think with different narrative possibilities, to rethink the continuities and disjuncture between locations and their entanglements with the monsoon and the climate crisis. And so I wonder if Naiza's work would still exist without the mass exploitation of water and land through time. The role of youth today in the climate discourse is an overwhelming, significant, critical, and personally alarming. It has proven to be efficient and transformative over time. However, it all started as a simple, responsive act towards the current conditions of our time. As a young person, I approach every aspect of artwork, textbooks, and conversations as avenues for learning and unlearning. I carry the awareness of my limited time on this earth, but also the awareness of fabricated truth. From propaganda campaigns advocating for combating climate change in the 1970s by oil and fossil fuels companies to control narratives, to the silencing of extensive scientific research on ways to conserve entire ecosystems. So here's a brief restating of numbers related to oceans close to me. We have 924 months left for the Maldives to lose 66% of its land area, and the displacement of 92,000 people from Seychelles Island. And so in today's discussion with the arts, I contemplate the act of responding. Naiza's beautiful projects are in conversation with herself, her geographies, and the in-between. She's both raising questions and responding to others. So art serves as a window for us to unboundly imagine futures, whereby hearing the sentence, the ocean's balance and preservation are essential for the survival and thriving of all forms of life, human and otherwise, art enables us to encounter multiple balances and imbalances, endangerment and preservation, and most importantly, death and survival. And it's not only contrast, which I stated, but also the multiplicities of expression and acts of both human and non-human bodies. So at last, as I persist in attempting to unravel my curiosities and bear witness to different hypocrisies and contradictions around the climate crisis, I recognize at the core, while navigating witty and loaded pop culture references, we are simply just responding. And so to begin our Q&A, considering the historical elitist association of the arts, I'm keen to hear insights from our panelists on effective strategies for incorporating indigenous, local, and translocal voices, particularly in this diverse and multicultural region, where voices vary across different nationalities and socioeconomic backgrounds, where these perspectives are integral to building authentic, communal, environmental, and climate literacy, within and through the arts and culture. So I invite reflections on past experiences, and that could serve us as examples of this context. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tolga. That was really insightful. I don't think any of us would have been able to introduce this Q&A, with such an insightful perspective. So really many thanks. Would any of you like to jump in and maybe answer either Tolga's question or bits of it, or react to what Tolga was mentioning?
I mean, I think it relates to what Nadia was saying also about how and what kinds of knowledge are generated, and that's what you're also pointing to, is the lack of attention paid to communities across time in terms of the validity of their knowledge and their understanding of their own environment and how climate change is affecting that. And the relationship to science and scientific data and scientific ways of measuring and articulating change. And I think, it's extremely important, both of your points regarding that. And it's something, of course, we're keenly aware of here. And we're keenly aware that stories from the global south still do not get told enough in places like COP. That the intersection of climate change with gender, with race, with poverty, with many, many different things are still not articulated enough at COP. This is something, for us as an institution and our, sister organizations, we're keenly aware of, and we work with the knowledge of to try and kind of bring conversations from colleagues, in our proximity in Asia, South Asia, Caucasus, Middle East, the geography where we're located in. We try as much as possible to bridge conversations historically and presently, and looking to the future as well.
There's a lot to unpick, no? And this is it's a many-headed question. Maybe we start with the elitism, which is historically absolutely right. No, I think the art world, or parts of the art world is painfully aware of the difficulty for communities to enter our spaces, no? Because it seems elitist. Our language has evolved into something that is pseudoscientific and hyper-precise, no? And in that, it's very opaque and abstract. And if you're not well versed in the art historical canon, you don't understand the comment on the comment on the comment on the comment. I think there are many organizations now that are trying to make the threshold barrier of entering into the spaces as low as possible. I think there's a lot of thinking and rehearsing, practicing around the question: who has the right to show? Who are the voices that are actually being heard or given space to in these spaces? What is the role of mediators, invigilators, that very often are just security guards, right? But they spend so much time in these spaces, and they're the first encounter into museum spaces specifically. So I think there's a lot that is happening there. I think what I hear underneath also is a question of hypocrisy and propaganda. I think again, many in the art world are trying to give visibility to as many realities as possible, understanding that they coexist. No, I think one of the big failures of modernism is this kind of universality, and then we pack globalism on top of it. No, and then everyone is we, everyone is us. All of it is going to be the same, and Starbucks is everywhere, right? So I think there is a lot happening. There's a lot happening in questions of equitable not only production of art, but also production of knowledge, and giving credit to the ones involved in the knowledge production. There is a lot of acknowledgement of community engagement in the communities that actually make up neighborhoods and audiences, the ones that feel invited to enter spaces, and the one that feel not comfortable in coming into these spaces. No? And I think there is a lot happening there. The art world, I think conceptually, is a progressive space. The art infrastructure is super conservative. And I think this is also something, and it became blatantly obvious during COVID, no? It's just a question of how the art world engaged with the digital sphere, and it was quite behind. The climate anxiety is real, is obviously very, very, very real. I think, again, the arts have a huge role to play in questions of mental health, and giving spaces where this anxiety can actually be voiced and can have a presence, where climate grievance can happen, right? We can create these spaces of communal mourning, right? Where this is not something that is just to be brushed aside and to be overcome immediately, but actually to give a moment and take it seriously. There's many more things in your question that I'm not going to address, because otherwise I'm going to monologue, which I don't want. But thank you very much for the question. Yeah.
Maybe I'll just add a couple of points, because I think a lot was covered, but this is a question that really frustrates me, and I think it goes way beyond and from before the issue of climate change and knowledge and science. And for me, like, the really frustrating part is the issue of class in the art world, right? And the exclusivity when it comes to class. I think it's really quite troubling, and I think, when it's coming, I would like to see the arts play a greater role, and maybe, I have a very particular utilitarian vision for the arts, right, which comes from my own sets of interests, because I think, we're heading towards a crisis if we're not already in one, and that we really need to be thinking all collectively in a very practical and tangible way about how to prepare for what's coming or what's already here. And I think that in order to have the art, I think we should encourage the arts to be more a part of that conversation. I do think that art still tends to be a little bit on the side, exclusive, marginal, and that some of this is self-chosen. And it can be quite frustrating, and I think we need to maybe think some of our models. I think the two institutions that are on this panel are really both thinking about these things in ways that not all art institutions are. But yeah, leaving the white box, working with universities and scientific institutions and governments, and just being out in public space and really engaging with community and not in one-off programs. Is really important. But I think, class has been one that's continuously frustrated me as somebody who works in the arts, how exclusive it can be.
Well, it's also conceptually just being pushed aside by identity, no? It's with the focus on identity, class kind of leaves the room. I think just to say, as a little bit hope, right? I think there are large policy frameworks that are actually catching up on the role that arts and critical arts can play, or the critical community of the arts and culture can play. Just as an example, the European Commission has this new framework which is called the New European Bauhaus, which is a questionable title in itself.
Very.
Yeah. But it has culture at its core. There's one of 6 prototypes which is called the Bauhaus of the Seas, which is really trying to unlock the radical prototyping potential of arts and culture in development, redevelopment, refurbishment processes on city scale, no? And then that's a continental research project, continent-wide research project. On the other hand, now leading up to the 3rd United Nations Oceans Conference, we, of all people, have been asked to lead a facilitation process which is one of 7 clusters, and that cluster is ocean art and science. And that means bringing together the community that works around that, artists, humanities, scientists, scientific organizations that are willing to work interdisciplinary, in an interdisciplinary way, and consolidate those concerns, write a synthesis report, and bring that to the declaration of the conference, right? So I think there are things happening. A lot of things are happening without really knowing who is being asked to the table and what that potential is. But I think this is the journey that we're on. No, we really don't know. We really don't know, and we have to be courageous. We have to be experimental. We have to base it as much as possible in knowledge. But yeah, it's a difficult road ahead.
And maybe just one quick thought, which is that basically, I mean, I agree with Marcus's point about the idea of like art institutions being like that art is progressive itself conceptually, and maybe art institutions are a little bit on the more conservative side. And I would say that like some of the integration of indigenous perspectives or local perspectives is happening on a very symbolic level. And I think that we really need to be thinking about this on a structural and institutional level, right? Not just on the, like we invite one person symbolically, we have some representatives, and then everybody goes home.
Or in some cases, it's being withdrawn, as we're seeing recently as well. Being withdrawn, yeah.
So, is there any question from the audience? Yeah, please.
First of all, thank you so much. I couldn't even imagine a situation like this to speak really openly about this kind of problem at this level. So thank you so much, really, personally. And, you know, just because we are really, you created this kind of environment, we are really speaking among friends. So I will pose this question, an open question to us all, including myself, because we are putting there so many key areas. Now, ocean, science, policy, arts at the very center. And we didn't mention today the word economy, private sector. And the reason why I want to open, really open question to us all is how we do engage with the economy in a very structural way. Because as human beings, and more than this, as a Western culture going everywhere and monopolizing the entire global system, we are not living in an ecological way. We are living in an economic way. And that means that our ecological niche is economy. It's not anymore nature. It's not even anymore the social environment. It's economic. So the economic is driven really everything. No, I do not want to sound too bad to this, but in any case, we really need to engage in order to change things and in order to drive those kind of changes. How we do think about our economic system, embracing our challenges. I would really love to know more about this and which kind of engagement are you thinking about, if any. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Just to add, because I'm sure this will go to your point, Nadia, I think there's one key aspect, at least in the way that we perceive it as Community Jameel. There's one key aspect to that. It's data. It's information. And this information has to come from the communities. So whatever you try to do, and there are so many great endeavors, including when it comes to climate change and the relation to the arts, it must be driven by the communities, and you must be able to understand, to be willing to understand what works. And then, and only then, will you able to leverage the economic power that you're referring to. But this is our perspective, and I'd love to hear more from yours.
So this is actually a subject that I'm really interested in. And also a lot of my work is looking at transitions, as I mentioned. And one of the biggest, one of the things I basically am grappling with is like how sticky things can be and how hard change can be. And part of that is because of the political economy, right? So I think there's two aspects to this question. So there's the aspect of the political economy and economic structures, and then there's the aspect of values, and those two things are of course integrated. So I think one of the ways in which the arts can be really helpful as well is we need a rethinking of the values, but the values alone and their rethinking is not enough. So we need to also rethink our political economic structures, which is a lot harder. So because I think our values are kind of changing, but the political economic structure is kind of the same, right? So how do we go about rethinking that political economic structure? And I'm gonna use a quote that I used yesterday as well, which is, this is a quote that I always like to use, which is a quote by Frederick Jameson, who says that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. Right? And I think that this is a really important point, and that we need to be rethinking our economic structures, and it's really hard. I don't know how you go about, like I said, like values are changing, but the economic structure isn't. So how do you go about like changing the economic structure when there's so much resistance? But that's like the key to everything, and nothing is going to really meaningfully change because, as I said, like installing some solar panels, like that's just.
Yeah. No, and I think the sentiment around the climate, whatever you want to call it, change, crisis, catastrophe, whatever you want to call it, has changed dramatically. Now this idea, and especially in the ocean, this idea of blue bonds, blue carbon, blue economy, I mean, it's like the El Dorado right now. It's crazy. It's really crazy. Just being at Climate Week in New York, it's like, wow, this has changed. Now the financial sector is there, and it's like, so I think we have to be very, very, very careful in setting up a new economy that doesn't just replicate all the injustices of the past. It's really interesting to have this conversation in an art space, because obviously the art space provides this. The art economy and the market is the pinnacle of capitalism. The way that we give economic value to rarefied objects, and then fetishize them is. So it's a good conversation to have here, because obviously we're not only implicated, but we have very close ties to the people. A lot of philanthropic organizations that fund art, right? Where does the money come from? On the other hand, and I think again, I'm looking at this public sculpture out here, which I have the privilege to look at, and you all have to turn around. But this is also, this is happening in the public sphere, which means these are micropolitics happening right there. And then the question is, how do we actually scale that from the micropolitics to something that is bigger? Because we need to make these happen, and this happens in a legal sphere, in an economic sphere, and so on. So these are models of futures waiting to happen, and we need to make them happen in the current realities. So again, we are in a very privileged situation to actually have been given the power and the agency and the space to prototype realities, and this reality also has to include economics. On the other hand, the space that allows for these very open conversations, whilst probably in the green zone, everybody is reconfirming, that we really have to do something. We have to stop talking. We really have to do something to come back together. Next year we have to stop talking, and we really have to start doing something. It's like we need to have these difficult conversations. And I think to your point, or to your working, to your job, right? On the one hand, there's the Vision 2030. On the one hand, there's the sustainability agenda that Saudi promotes itself through. On the other hand, like I said earlier, there's the oil dependency sustainability program, which is very strategically thinking about how to hook developing countries into fossil fuels. And so the question is really, where does this conversation between the work that you're doing and the work that has also been done in other rooms, where does this actually happen in a way that is productive, right? And understanding that there are discrepancies, there are dissonances that need to be overcome, but they need to be addressed, and they need to be, these agendas need to be in the open, right? And so, sorry for just putting you on the spot there. It's happening everywhere, no? It's like, but I think we just need to be very honest and open and find spaces where we can do that.
So yes, one very last question, and then we'll have to wrap it up. I see that. Thank you. But
hello. So interesting. I come also from the economic perspective, not from the art nor from the science. And as I was hearing you, I was thinking one element, guys, is missing there in the picture. That's the power that you need, the diesel fuel that you need to fuel whatever energy you're putting into that work. At the same time, I was also coming from a small country called Lebanon with roots in Palestine, Jerusalem. I was thinking, I haven't seen anything. That's the health ocean. What's happening in Gaza and what's happening in Lebanon, the bomb, the white phosphoric bomb, and its effect on the environment that are going to stay with us for a very long time. And the demolition of hundreds of thousands of houses that are all seeping into the sea now, with the sewage water, with all the garbage that even the municipality were not given during the ceasefire, the time to collect the garbage. They were not given the fuel so that they can collect the garbage. So that's one sure way of all this going into the ocean. And knowing Nora also coming from that same small country, I was wondering why, guys, I don't see more initiative on showing that impact of war, what is causing in Sudan, in Libya, in everywhere of the world, that's causing more harm. These poor countries don't usually produce waste because they're very efficient when it comes to waste management by nature, because they either eat it or they give it to their animals. And there is very little waste. So this is my question. I would have liked to see some initiative coming from your space or from the space of Abdellatif Jameel, from the space of the Jameel Foundation, to see we hear in the news the cost of one bomb and the cost of the war, a daily cost on Israel. But we never heard the cost of all this cleaning up the mess, what will, aside from the human loss. The human loss is mentioned. Thank you very much.
so thank you very much for your question. And I think it is a very important topic. And it is just to say that from our side, Community Jameel, Abdul Latif Jameel, and Art Jameel, I know this is a question that is very dear to our hearts and very much, I must say, in our daily basis action at the moment. So just to explain what we're doing at the moment, Abdul Latif Jameel, so the company that is behind the Jameel family, and we usually don't mention it because we tend to operate separately, but Abdul Latif Jameel has been given a lot of funding towards the situation in Gaza to actually support as much as they can, not only from a kind of operational perspective, but also through Community Jameel from a health perspective. So we have also collaborated with Save the Children to actually try and bring mainly the babies and children out of Gaza for them to be able to get healthcare, proper healthcare in Egypt. So you are right, there is the question of the garbage, but behind the question of the garbage, and mainly, unfortunately, at the moment, there is also the question of the human beings. So we were trying to address this first. We might be able to get to this question, but I think in a second time. But maybe over to you, Nora, if you would like to say how it is that you, as Art Jameel, might be tackling the question at the moment.
No, I mean, I completely agree with you. I mean, ecocide is a strategy of warfare for, I would say centuries, not just in Palestine, but even if you look at indigenous struggles across the world, ecocide is a factor there. And it's not just about what's happening now, but the slow violence of this unfolding. And yes, in Lebanon, you're feeling the slow violence even of the civil war still unfolding. The corruption is present in the garbage crisis, in the environmental crisis, and all of it. It's all intertwined. It's just there, you see it and you feel it in your body much more than you would in other places, right? It's very immediate, and it's the same in Palestine. And this is what I was saying about severing relationships to land and erasing relationships to land is part of that kind of warfare and part of that kind of colonization. So this is something we're extremely aware of course, as practitioners living here. Our communities are also extremely personally related to these spaces, and it's something we do think about with the artists we work with, how we talk about our programs, the things we do behind the scenes as well, and not just in our exhibition spaces. So it's very much on our mind.
Two things. The Gaza situation. We have started a project relatively immediately that I can't talk about because it involves really existences, but it's been very distressing, and the foundation is trying to find a meaningful way to engage with that. The situation in Europe is a disgrace. One has to say that, right? And so to try to navigate that, making a meaningful contribution without harming existences that need to, and voices that need to be heard, is a challenge right now, and we're trying to deal with that. That's the one thing. I think the other thing, so we haven't immediately connected what you've just said, the environmental impact on from all kinds of violent conflict. No, Ukraine, Black Sea, similar, right? But there are many projects going on that are really looking at historic ammunition dumping into the sea. No, the sea has been used not only, it first entered into the COP discourse as a carbon sink. It's always been used as a dump site. No, and so the slow seepage of toxicity coming from massive ammunition dumping all over the place in every ocean and sea. On this planet, on every body of water, there's nearly every body of water, there's ammunition, no, and very few people, or it's not necessarily discussed in very big public spheres, but there's many projects that are addressing that and are trying to salvage those dumped ammunitions. But absolutely, to your point, you're absolutely right.
Maybe I'll just add two things. So one, I think like Noura was talking about ecocide, and I think that part of the issue sometimes with things like this, right, like there's the panic and the crisis, right, and the ecocide kind of falls by the wayside, even though it's an integral part of the strategy of making this place long-term unlivable, right? But at the same time, because of the humanitarian crisis, we can forget about the, like the ecocide falls by the wayside, which is understandable, but also creates like a very difficult situation to address these things at times. So that's one thing. And then my second point would be, like this brings us back to the conversation around the economy and the political economy of weapons manufacturing and warfare, right? And so this is why we continue to have these situations, even though we know better by now in terms of like the damage that they do, not just for environmental health, but for public health. You're seeing all kinds of like antibiotic resistance bacteria coming out of places like Iraq, that are very terrifying. And the same thing is happening today in Palestine.
So I think that I'm getting big signs that we need to wrap this up, and you must all probably be very hungry. So just to finish, and I'll try and finish on a positive note, art can translate science into compelling stories. This is a certainty. It can improve our well-being. It can support climate justice to reshape our narratives. let's not forget that the climate crisis, as you said rightfully, is a health crisis with dreadful impact on our oceans, on our sea, on our rivers, and most of all on our communities. I think that one day probably we will stop calling this river a river, we will call it our river, and we will all feel much more comfortable about it. So thank you very much for being here today. Thank you very much, Nora, Nadia, Marcus, and I do invite you to have a closer look to the pavilion. Thank you.